So, Oscar Goldman is a second-year doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge conducting dialogic and textual analysis on Latin satiric poetry. This project is supervised by Professor Emily Gowers and co-supervised by Dr. Ingo Gildenhard. Oscar currently holds a BA Honours in Classics and Ancient History from the University of Queensland, an MA in Classics with a focus on philology from King's College London, and an MPhil in Classics with a focus on literature from the University of Cambridge. Oscar has written theses on Lysias' rhetoric, Heraclitus' metaphysics, and Horace's satires, and he is currently engaged in teaching Latin at both a faculty and college level. Oscar plans on pursuing a career in academia or language pedagogy. His paper today is entitled Horace and Satiric Sermo. So over to you, Oscar.
Introduction. Is the PowerPoint sharing okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Brilliant, fantastic. So good afternoon. As you said, yes, the topic of my presentation today is satire as sermo, sermo being the Latin word for conversation. Specifically, I'm going to look at Horace's two books of conversations, or sermones. So these are a collection of hexameter Latin satires written between roughly 35 and 30 BC. So the key research question I want to address is what is sermonic or conversational about these poems, and how is conversation made manifest? So I've placed all the relevant source work in the handout for the curious and the critical amongst you. But ideally, one should be able to make it through this presentation with your attention divided sort of only between my voice and the PowerPoint. So I have structured the presentation as follows. So first, I'm going to discuss why one might do this study in the first place, situating this presentation and the paper in recent trends in scholarship. I'm then going to introduce the concept of conversational phenomena and explain why we might go looking for them in some of Horace's poetry. And then we're going to take a look at three sets of interactions from book 2, where I will hopefully convince you of not only the presence of various conversational phenomena, but indeed their relevance and importance for our study of Latin satire. I'll then explore how we might contextualize such analyses and their findings in our wider approaches to Latin satiric poetry. So nunc aliquis mihi dicat. So someone might say to me, why bother? Well, there are three key reasons why I believe this study should at least be attempted. The first is that sermo is a fundamental aspect of at least Horace's satires, as the Latin title suggests, if not the Latin satiric tradition from Lucilius to Juvenal. So this is demonstrated in the framing of Horace's first book of satires as a conversation with Maecenas, the frequent use of rhetorical interlocutors, the pseudo-Platonic / dramatic dialogues of book 2, and the frequent use of language associated with dialogic texts, namely Roman comedy. The second reason is that studies employing similar or identical methodologies elsewhere in classics have been productive. So I note the studies on the handout. Conversational dialogic analysis has been, in my opinion, successfully carried out on the Homeric corpus, Attic theatre, and Roman comedy, as well as other textual traditions outside of classical and even European languages. And finally, aspects of the metrical composition of speech in Horace's satires indicates that our poet paid close attention to the construction of speech within his larger poetic structure. So quantitative analysis indicates that Horace was extremely mindful of meter in his use of sermo. 74% of speech turns occur at natural metrical pauses in the line, no small coincidence. Furthermore, Freudenberg's 1996 article demonstrates how a similar quantitative analysis of elision and satsverse reveals the various idiolects of 2.3 and 2.4. So the satsverse imitating pithy philosophical statement, and the elision parodying the rough or rustic style of the Stoic Damasippus. So I want to advance this discussion beyond mere characters to say that not only are distinct speakers characterized differently, but indeed distinct speaker interactions are constructed with deliberate stylistic variation. And this variation is achieved through the manifestation of conversational phenomena. So on the screen is a big list of things classified as conversational phenomena. That is, phenomena considered to be mimetic of real speech, both specifically in Latin, but also more generally in world literature. Again, see the handout for the numerous scholars which have contributed to this list. Instantiating such phenomena in satiric poetry establishes intertextuality with other dialogic texts. It focuses our attention on representations of speech, and it helps to animate satire's trademark, but questionable polyphonia. Speaker transitions will be the key focus of this presentation. So that is when one speaker stops and another starts. I've listed other phenomena as we're going to see that such mimetic expressions tend to aggregate at particular speech turns. This aggregation produces a strong conversational tone and context, from which we can draw out additional meaning for interpreting the poetry. I want to emphasize here and now that these phenomena are by no means particular only to real speech or imitations thereof, but rather statistically frequent in the mimesis of speech and found often in Latin representations of conversation. So to summarize this introduction and move on to the analysis, there's been a recent trend in scholarship looking at dialogic aspects of classical poetry. This trend emphasizes pragmatic linguistic approaches and values contextual analysis over top-down approaches. Quantitative analysis, both my own and Freudenberg's, demonstrates that Horace makes use of poetics to vary the speech in his satiric poetry, to the effect of producing various characterizations and microlects. We can also expect such variation to occur at speaker transitions and to be constructed using mimetic conversational phenomena. So let us turn now to our first examples. So the first speech turns to be analyzed come from Satires 2.1, and I'm very grateful to Sophia for having so thoroughly introduced the poem, thus saving me some time. So numerous scholars have already noted how Trebatius' speech is constructed using quasi-legal terminology and constructions. Horace characterizes his conversational partner in a particular way. The dialogue itself is known for its meandering nature, a constant circumambulation around the key question: is Horace going to continue to write satires? Although the existence of the text itself provides the answer, in-text confirmation is delayed until the very end. So I draw your attention to this dialogic exchange. Trebatius warns Horace that if he writes mala carmina, meaning libel, there may be legal repercussions. Horace responds with an enthusiastic and elliptical miscommunication, reading mala carmina not as libel, but rather as bad poetry, and asks if Trebatius' warning applies if he writes bona carmina, meaning good or well-written poetry. A perfectly tame Horatian joke, yet the construction of the speech turns is rich in conversational phenomena, which aids us in interpreting the delivery. First, the elision. So as Suberan notes in their tome on elision in Latin poetry, the blurring together of vowels often creates a sonic impression in relation to the poetic context. What is being conveyed here? Well, let's be pragmatic and look at the context. So Horace's repetition of Trebatius' si quis, several times indeed as the passage continues, is particularly reminiscent of repetition used in interruptive statements from Roman comedy, see Müller on the handout. This reading is supported by scholars from the field of conversational analysis. Tannen notes that multiple repetitions tend to accompany a faster or more agitated pace of dialogic interaction. Furthermore, the use of short, fragmented, or jerky, as Bonifazzi and company term it, syntax is noted for its use in both Greek and Roman drama to convey alarm, intense emotion, despair, and/or emotional climax. The aggregate conversational phenomena convey a sense of agitation. This sermonic context thus leads me to read that the intra-speaker elision at judicium questo is an audible, agitated interruption from Horace. Occurring in the second foot, not a common place to change speaker, one might imagine that the reader or the audience is caught off guard as Horace intrudes into the end of Trebatius' speech turn. Hoc juvat. How does this help us read satire? Well, I'm glad you asked. Reading these nuances of dialogic interaction gives us greater insight into methods and results of characterization. I noted earlier that the poem is known for its meandering dialogue. The question of Horace's Carmina is foregrounded in the opening, yet only directly readdressed here. Indeed, this interaction is the apex of the conversation itself, with Trebatius finally fulfilling his dual role as both legal consultant and Horace's satiric shadow boxer. Horace is quick to respond to Trebatius' warning, and as we have seen, recycles his language through repetition and misunderstanding. Interruption leads Horace's impassioned counter-arguments, which are that Horace is not just someone, but a friend of Augustus Caesar, and that his poems will henceforth be good, however we might interpret that. The elision thus manifests alongside the other conversational phenomena. Horace's impatience and/or excitement. Impatience to get going with book 2, and his excitement to tell Trebatius, and thereby the reader, about his new socio-political literary credentials. Recognizing interruption and the surrounding sermonic context evidences Horace's fusion of Latin poetics and linguistic phenomena, and the importance of paying attention to oral elements of the text. Elided interruptions function not only in generating an oral element to their immediate poetic context, but also to contrast with smoother turns. So let us turn to 2.3, a poem in which Damasippus breaks in on Horace's writing retreat to give him a second-hand lecture on Stoic principles. An integral element of Horace's self-representation in this poem is what scholars have termed Socratic posturing, indicated by, amongst other things, the use of obone in the poem, being a translation of oagathe from Plato. Horace figures himself as a Roman Socrates. Keep this in mind. So after Damasippus delivers his lengthy monologue, being around 300 lines, Horace retorts with what can easily be read as a smooth speaker transition. So note the use of the line beginnings to enact the speech tones, the artfully alliterative subclause quam stultitia corneam non est genus, placed within the main clause, and although Horace ends his question in putas, Damasippus is silent until Horace finishes speaking. Horace's question is, in contrast with the disjunctive turns we've seen in 2.1, a calm parody of Socratic inquiry in both form and content. But compare this exchange to the one that precedes it. A plethora of more agitated conversational phenomena are on display. So here, the transition falls on a more regular metrical beat, yet the harsh elision between witio and akippe weakens reading any bucolic diaresis. The use of akippe after a direct question is itself a strong signal of transition and interjection, fitting perhaps for the mock Socratic dynamic of Horace and Damasippus's dialogue. We can see that Horace shifts from the playfully constructed questioning seen earlier, the alliterative subclause, to the use of an imperative, edicere, followed by a direct question. Precisely as in 2.1, it seems that Horace wants to just get to the point. Horace's mention of witio seems to trigger a reaction from the Stoic preacher that is more direct. He answers the question without one of his usual parables. More forceful, begins with akippe interjecting into the end of Horace's speech turn, and more personal than his previous responses. It is not only that Horace has asked a direct question from which there can be no procrastination. Horace asks a direct question regarding his witium, a term encompassing far more personal failings than mere stultitia, and one used frequently in both satiric and Stoic writing, giving, as it were, Damasippus permission to critique Horace in a variety of social, economic, and artistic spheres. So we might say that the use of such a loaded term triggers Damasippus. But let us suspend discussion of characterization for a moment as we investigate how this conversation concludes. As Damasippus launches into personal invective, beginning with the elided interruption seen previously, Horace attempts to stop him. Iam Deicene and teneas Damasippe tuiste both interject into a singular speech act which they attempt to stop. Note that they begin and end at natural metrical pauses. The separate speakers are emphasized as distinct rather than blurring together audibly with elision. This is the only exchange in the corpus where one speaker is interrupted by another but continues speaking as if they had not heard them. Cultum maiorum censu must be either another object of non dico or the object of a similar verb implied but muffled by Horace's interruption. Damasippus' speech turn likely stretches all the way from non dico to furores, and as it encloses Horace's interjections in the text, we thus see here a representation of overlap generated syntactically. Horace and Damasippus are speaking over rather than with each other. This is naturally contrasted with the Socratic posturing invoked throughout the poem, a complete dialogic breakdown in a parody of philosophical dialectic. Indeed, the interjectory nature of Horace's Iam Deicene is noted by Müller to be indicative of direct provocation, and it requires no great imaginative leap to wonder why our satirist might be provoked here. So what does this mean for the text? Well, in comparing these three sets of interactions from 2.3, we see Horace's manifold artistry in representing different forms of dialogic communication and miscommunication. variations in the use of the meter to begin speech turns allows for contrast between Socratically smooth exchanges and satirically dysfunctional interruption. These variations map onto the expected tone of the content itself. Horace's Socratic irony, asking about his stultitia, Damasippus's excitement at the mention of Whitio, and Horace's agitation as Damasippus begins to strike multiple personal nerves. Such variation reinforces the central thesis of the paper and presentation, that Sermo is constructed with attention paid both to poetic stylistics and to the mimesis of conversational phenomena. So the final pair of interactions to be analyzed come from my personal favorite of Horace's satires. So in 2.7, the mantle of satirist is taken up by Horace's slave Davus in the celebrated Saturnalia, conveying, according to Cucchiarelli, no less than the very birth of satire itself. The exchange in the opening features a concentration of conversational phenomena, which gives a vivid impression of dialogue. So please pardon the rough metrical annotation. I'm by no means a PowerPoint artist. But if we read the passage with a sensitivity to Sermo, the phenomena really do stand out quite easily. So we have conversational referentiality, is that Davus, repetition, Davus, turn initial dialogic markers, ita, age, a high elision rate, 5 in 5 lines, Horace's average being about 4 for every 10 lines, and imperatives, age, utere, nara, all focus our attention on the interaction between speakers and the consequent characterization. Davus begins the dialogue with strong use of negative politeness, phrasing his request indirectly, giving deference to Horace through the use of domino, and generally minimizing his imposition, pauca. The implementation of these strategies is harmonized with their metrical delivery, a dialogic poetics similar to those discussed in Haynes' 1989 article on English dialogic poetry. The first line begins with a double spondi, featuring 2 long elisions, manifesting orally both the long duration for which Davus has been listening. Indeed, scholars note how Davus recycles and weaponizes much of Horace's first book of satires against him, and also the trepidation with which he approaches the satirist. His transition to rapid dactyls to finish the line again slows at reformido. He hesitates and waits for permission from Horace to continue. The smooth transition affected by the change of speaker at the heptamimeral caesura introduces Horace's own measured reply, the spondaic Davus, which is quickly interrupted by Davus himself with the ita. The interjection picks up the rapid beats of the line, as Davus hastens to excuse himself even further. The negative politeness, masking Davus's agitation, is thus soon demonstrated in the subsequent monologue to be a facade, an iteration of faux politesse in Book 2. The elided interjection thus condenses Davus's interruption of Horace's life, and indeed perhaps his satires, and preludes the personal invective he is about to proclaim. Horace's threefold use of imperatives and lack of any reciprocal politeness displays his perception of their relative status, a perception that Davus attempts to invert. The end of this dialogue features several parallels with that of 2.3 and is also a dialogically rich set of utterances. Davus ends his lecture with a series of personal attacks on Horace, who then seeks to shut down the conversation. Here, the threat of physical violence is naturally related to Davus' serval status. Syntactic interruption and/or overt repetition is present in Horace's unde, mirroring the syntactic fragmentation of Damasippus' speech seen earlier. The rapid changes of speaker animate the dialogue with jerky and elliptical syntax in mimesis of agitation. The breakdown of conversation, just as in 2.3, is manifest through the poetic whiplash or philosophical monologue to dialogic shouting mash. So, what have we learned? Well, we've seen how Horace fuses mimetic dialogic phenomena with hexameter stylistics, and that there is an astonishing level of detail in the construction of speech turns. I've argued that interruption is made manifest in Horace's satires through the use of elision and syntax, and that speaker interactions are used to generate and contribute to meaning in a broader poetic sense. The interruptions are therefore oral manifestations of some of Horace's satiric motifs. Where do we go from here? Well, mapping interruptions and dialogic phenomena is just one aspect of a wider array of sermonic stylistics, which comprise Horace's methods of speaker characterization. The use of the meter, in particular, to convey different forms of speaker transitions may contribute to our understanding of the performative aspect of these poems. Perhaps it's easier to hear rather than to read speaker attribution. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, I believe that this study will reveal a new layer of humor and entertainment in the text. So as argued most cogently by Maria Plaza, these texts are not only loci for socio-political and literary cultural criticism, they're also rather funny, playful, and above all, conversational. Thank you very much.